He ruled New York for 23 years. It took one morning in court to burn it all down. Damian Moretti walked into that courthouse like he owned it, because for 2 decades he practically did. One hand wrapped around Bianca's waist, the other straightening his tie for the cameras. He was smiling, actually smiling, like this was a press conference, not the day his wife of 23 years was about to take everything he'd spent his life building. He never saw it coming. Nobody did. If you've ever watched someone powerful destroy themselves with their own arrogance, stay with me. Because what happened inside that courtroom didn't just end a marriage, it exposed a man. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The alarm didn't wake Damian Moretti that morning. He hadn't slept. He lay flat on his back in the penthouse bedroom of a hotel that cost $11,000 a night, staring at the ceiling with the kind of stillness that had nothing to do with peace. Bianca was curled against his shoulder, her breathing slow and even, one manicured hand resting on his chest like a claim. She smelled like expensive perfume and last night's champagne. She was 29 years old and she had no idea what today actually meant. Damian did. He swung his legs over the side of the bed before 5 a.m. and sat there in the dark, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. The skyline through the floor-to-ceiling glass was still half lit, orange bleeding into black, the city grinding through its last hour before dawn. He'd looked at that skyline 1,000 times from 100 different windows, and it had always felt like a mirror, something that reflected back what he was. Enormous, relentless, unmovable. This morning, it just looked like buildings. He dressed without turning on the lights. Black suit, white shirt, no tie. His lawyers had argued for a tie, said it looked more sympathetic to the judge. Damian had told them he didn't need to look sympathetic. He needed to look like what he was. He needed to look like a man who wins. That was the first mistake. He'd make several more before noon. His name was Damian Moretti, and if you lived in New York and you knew anything worth knowing, that name landed somewhere between reverence and terror depending on which side of his ledger you were on. 51 years old, 6'2". The kind of face that had been handsome once and was now just hard, jaw like concrete, eyes the color of old ice. A scar along his left cheekbone from a knife fight in 1999 that he'd won decisively and never talked about again. He ran 3 legitimate holding companies, 2 real estate conglomerates, and a private equity firm that managed assets the government had never quite been able to trace back to anything they could prosecute. He also ran other things that didn't appear in annual reports. For 23 years, he had been married to Elena Vasquez Moretti, and for most of those years, he had treated that marriage the way powerful men often do, as background, as infrastructure. Elena was there the way foundations are there. You don't think about them. You don't praise them. You just build on top of them and assume they'll hold. He assumed wrong. By 6:15, his security detail had him in the back of a blacked-out Escalade moving through pre-dawn Manhattan. His lead attorney, Paul Greaves, was already on the phone in the front seat, voice low and efficient, running through the day's schedule like a general before a battle. Greaves was 60 years old, silver-haired, and expensive enough that his hourly rate could have paid a schoolteacher's monthly salary. He had won cases that should have been impossible. He had a way of making juries forget things they'd seen with their own eyes. Damian had hired him because he was the best. He hadn't questioned whether the best was good enough for what Elena had prepared. That was the second mistake. "We go in at 9, Greaves said without turning around. "Opposing counsel opens with the financial records. Let them. Our response package is ready. By 11, we'll have reframed the entire narrative." "She's going to try the sympathy angle," Damian said. His voice was flat, unhurried. "She always does. We're ready for that too." Damian looked out the window. A garbage truck was grinding its way down a side street, 2 men hanging off the back in the gray early light, working like they always worked, invisible to everyone who didn't need to look. He watched them until they disappeared behind a corner. "She won't cry," he said, more to himself than Greaves. "Elena never cries." Greaves paused. "That's not necessarily something we need to account for." "I know." Damian turned back to the glass. "I'm just saying." He hadn't spoken to Elena directly in 4 months. Their last real conversation, not through lawyers, not through intermediaries, but actually face-to-face, had been in the kitchen of their Upper East Side house on a Tuesday morning in February. He'd come home at 2 in the morning, which was not unusual. She'd been sitting at the kitchen island in the dark, drinking tea, still dressed, like she'd been waiting. She probably had been. She'd looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, not with tears. Just with this flat, exhausted clarity that had unsettled him more than any screaming match would have. "I know about Bianca," she'd said. He hadn't denied it. She'd nodded once, like she'd expected exactly that, finished her tea, set the cup down carefully, and walked upstairs. By the time his lawyers received the divorce filing, it was Thursday. He'd thought it would be simple. He'd thought she'd be devastated, disoriented, too shattered to fight cleanly. He'd been married to Elena for 23 years, and somehow, in all that time, he'd managed to completely misunderstand what she was made of. The courthouse steps were already swarming by 8:45. Word had gotten out. In this city, word always got out. And there were photographers 3 deep along the marble steps, plus a cluster of reporters who'd been tipped off about the spectacle Damien's public relations team had quietly engineered. Because Damien had wanted this public. He'd wanted the images. Him, vital and confident, moving forward with Bianca on his arm. Elena, left behind. A clear visual story that he was the one choosing, the one with power, the one who decided how this chapter ended. He stepped out of the Escalade with Bianca's hand in his, and he gave them exactly what they'd come for. She was stunning, Bianca. Nobody could take that away from her. Dark hair, red dress under a tailored coat, cheekbones that could cut glass. She leaned into him as the cameras fired, and she smiled the smile of a woman who believes she has won something. Damien squared his shoulders and walked up those steps like he was walking into a boardroom negotiation he'd already decided the outcome of. The crowd parted. It always did. He didn't see Elena until he was inside. She was already seated at the plaintiff's table when he came through the doors, and the first thing he registered, despite himself, despite everything, was how still she was. No fidgeting, no visible anxiety. Her attorney, a woman named Carla Voss, who'd built a career dismantling the financial defenses of wealthy men in exactly these kinds of proceedings, sat beside her arranging papers with quiet efficiency. Elena's hands were folded on the table. Her suit was dark gray, understated, the kind of thing that made you look twice to notice it was expensive. Her hair was pulled back. She wore no jewelry except her wedding ring, which she would remove before the proceedings ended. Damien would notice that detail later, and it would bother him more than he expected. She didn't look at him when he entered. That bothered him too. He didn't know exactly what he'd expected. Some crack in her composure, some flinch when she saw him come in with Bianca following behind, already being positioned in the gallery by his PR handlers. But Elena just sat there looking at her notes like the room around her barely existed. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Dole, was a compact woman in her late 60s with a reputation for being deeply unimpressed by wealthy men who confused authority with being right. Damien knew her record. Greaves had briefed him thoroughly. He'd factored her in. He'd factored in everything. Except what was in those documents Elena's attorney had spent 11 months assembling. The opening arguments were formal and measured, the kind of procedural language that sounds like nothing until you realize each carefully chosen word is the tip of a knife. Greaves presented Damien's case with the polished precision of a man who'd done this 100 times. Damien Moretti, self-made, visionary, the architect of a business empire built from almost nothing, a man whose genius had generated the wealth now at stake. Elena's contribution acknowledged, of course, a capable mother, a supportive spouse, but the language was minimizing in the way expensive language always is, death by 1,000 qualifications. Elena's attorney, Carla Voss, let Greaves finish without interrupting. She had a pad of legal paper on the table in front of her, and she made notes throughout his opening in a handwriting so small it was almost illegible from across the room. When it was her turn, she stood up, buttoned her jacket, and said 5 sentences. She said that the financial records would show that Elena Moretti had made the first significant capital investment in what became the Moretti Empire, using money from her own family at a time when Damien Moretti had outstanding debts to 4 different creditors and no legitimate assets whatsoever. She said that testimony would establish Elena's direct operational role in the legitimate businesses throughout the marriage. She said that evidence would demonstrate a pattern of infidelity spanning nearly a decade, documented thoroughly. She said that the court would ultimately see that Elena Moretti had not simply supported this empire from the sidelines. She had quietly and systematically made it possible. And she said that the court would reach its conclusion accordingly. Then she sat down. Damien kept his face perfectly neutral. He was very good at that. But under the table, his right hand had closed into a fist without him deciding to do it. The first witness Carla Voss called was a forensic accountant named Howard Lim, a small, precise man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of careful stillness that suggested he'd spent his career being very sure before he spoke. He carried a binder the thickness of a dictionary. He set it on the stand and opened it to a page he'd clearly marked in advance. What followed was 45 minutes of testimony that quietly and methodically demolished the story Damien had been telling about himself for 2 decades. The bank records were dated 2001. Damien had been 28, newly arrived from a background he'd spent years obscuring, with ambitions that were enormous and resources that were not. Elena's family, old money from a Sicilian-American merchant family, the kind of wealth that didn't advertise itself, had provided a capital injection of just over $2 million. The record showed this clearly. Elena's name was on the originating account. Her signature was on the transfer authorization. Damien's name appeared nowhere on that document because at that point, Damien Moretti didn't have the kind of name that appeared on documents of that nature. That $2 million had become the seed of everything. Damien sat very still through all of it. Then came the business records. Emails, meeting minutes, internal memos. 11 years of documents showing Elena's fingerprints on decisions she had never publicly claimed credit for. Vendor negotiations she'd conducted, financial irregularities she'd identified and quietly resolved before they became problems. Alliance agreements with rival families, not criminal alliances, the carefully legal ones, the handshakes between legitimate businesses that happened to be operated by people with complicated histories, that Elena had personally brokered through relationships her own family provided. During a particularly brutal stretch of corporate raids in 2009 and 2010, when 2 of Damien's holding companies had come under scrutiny and the paper trail had grown dangerously warm, it was Elena who'd managed the reorganization. It was Elena who'd restructured the asset holdings, moved the money through channels that kept everything clean, ensured the audits found nothing worth prosecuting. She'd done all of this while raising 2 children. She'd done all of this while her husband was, as the records would later show, spending weekends in Miami with a 22-year-old woman named Bianca Russo. Damien didn't look at Bianca during this testimony. He couldn't afford to give the photographers the shot. Greaves pushed back methodically during cross-examination, disputed the characterization of Elena's role, reframed contributions as advisory rather than operational, challenged the forensic accountant on several technical interpretations that created enough ambiguity to complicate a simple narrative. He was good. He was very good. But the documents existed, and the documents said what they said. And a forensic accountant who'd spent his career reading documents like these was not a witness that lawyerly charm could easily dislodge. The session recessed at 12:30. Damien found a private room down the hall from the courtroom and sat in it with Greaves for 20 minutes while his security waited outside. He didn't say anything for the first 3 minutes. Greaves didn't push him. "How bad?" Damien finally asked. Greaves was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that tells you everything. The financial foundation is, they've documented it thoroughly. The 2001 transfer is airtight. We can argue about what it means, about whether it constitutes a business contribution versus a personal loan that was informally forgiven, but how bad? Damien said again. Greaves took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. We have a problem with the infidelity documentation. The private messages there's volume there, years of volume. It's going to affect the custody determination significantly, and custody affects asset distribution under, I know how it affects it. Damien's voice had gone very quiet. That particular quietness was something the men who worked for him had learned over the years to be afraid of. What I'm asking you is whether we can stop it. Another pause. Not all of it, Greaves said. Some of it we can challenge on admissibility grounds. The surveillance materials, there are procedural questions. But the messages are authenticated, and if Bianca's name appears as prominently in them as I'm told it does, Damien stood up abruptly, walked to the window, looked out at a view of a parking structure and a slice of gray Manhattan sky. He thought about Elena sitting at that table, her hands folded, her face calm. 11 months of preparation, and she'd never once, through any intermediary, through any shared acquaintance, through any back channel that he would have noticed, given any indication of what she was building. 23 years he'd been married to the woman. He hadn't known her at all. "Get back in there," he said. "We keep fighting." Greaves nodded and gathered his papers. At the door he paused. "Damien, for what it's worth, I've never seen a financial documentation package assembled like that. Whoever she hired, they were meticulous. They were very, very meticulous." Damien didn't respond. Greaves left. He stood at that window for another 2 minutes by himself. The parking structure stared back at him. Down on the street, he could see a woman pushing a stroller, not looking up, just moving forward, and for a reason he couldn't explain and wouldn't have admitted to anyone, that image held his attention until his security detail knocked twice on the door to tell him it was time to go back in. He turned from the window. He straightened his jacket. He walked back into that courtroom, not knowing that in a matter of weeks he would lose his children, half his fortune, and the last protective fiction he'd built about what kind of man he actually was. The worst part, the part that would keep him awake years later in houses that were quieter than anything he'd ever known, was that he would deserve every bit of it. But right now, standing at the doors of the courtroom, Damien Moretti still believed he was going to win, and that belief, more than anything else, was about to destroy him. The afternoon session began at 2 o'clock, and the light coming through the high courtroom windows had shifted to that flat gray quality that makes everything look slightly more serious than it already is. Damien settled into his chair with the practiced ease of a man who'd sat in difficult rooms his entire life. His jacket was buttoned. His hands were on the table. To anyone watching from the gallery, he looked composed, measured, in control. He was none of those things. Carla Voss stood at the front of the courtroom and called her second witness, a woman named Patricia Dunn, 63 years old, who had served as the administrative director of Moretti Holdings' first legitimate real estate subsidiary for 11 years, beginning in 2003. She was a small woman with white hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she took the stand with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had been waiting a long time to say exactly what she was about to say. Greaves had known about Patricia Dunn. He'd deposed her 6 weeks earlier, cataloged her potential testimony, assessed the damage, and concluded she was manageable. He'd been operating on the assumption that her recollections of Elena's involvement would be impressionistic, the kind of vague supportive testimony that sounds significant and proves nothing. He'd been wrong about that. Patricia Dunn did not speak in impressions. She spoke in dates, meeting times, specific decisions, and direct quotes that she had, it turned out documented in personal journals she'd kept throughout her tenure, because she'd had the instinct early on that the Moretti operation was the kind of place where written records might one day matter. She produced those journals now. Carla Voss entered them into evidence with the quiet satisfaction of someone setting down a very heavy object that had been a long time coming. The testimony covered 37 specific instances across 8 years in which Elena Moretti had made executive-level decisions affecting the subsidiary's operations. Decisions that were then attributed to Damien in official communications, or simply attributed to no one at all, absorbed into the machinery of the company like they had occurred naturally. Vendor contracts Elena had restructured. A property acquisition in 2006 that Elena had identified, valued, and negotiated while Damien was in Europe for 6 weeks, dealing with matters Patricia Dunn tactfully described as unrelated to the business. A personnel crisis in 2008, a senior manager skimming accounts that Elena had discovered, documented, and resolved without ever surfacing it publicly in a way that would have drawn scrutiny to the company's internal controls. "In your assessment," Carla Voss asked, standing very still in the way she did when she wanted a witness to feel the weight of a question, who was functionally running the day-to-day operations of Moretti Holdings' real estate division during those years? Patricia Dunn adjusted her glasses. She looked directly at the judge rather than at either attorney. "Elena," she said simply. "Elena was running it." Greaves objected on foundation grounds. Judge Dole sustained it technically, but the words were already in the room, already sitting in the air, and everyone present understood that a sustained objection doesn't unring a bell. Damien's jaw had tightened fractionally. Only someone watching very closely would have caught it. Bianca, from her position in the gallery, was not watching closely. She was checking the time on her phone with the delicate discretion of someone who believed she was being subtle. Cross-examination was aggressive. Greaves came at Patricia Dunn hard. Her relationship with Elena, her motivations for testifying, the reliability of personal journals as legal documentation, the distinction between advisory and operational authority. He was skilled and he was relentless, and Patricia Dunn absorbed every question with the calm patience of someone who had rehearsed for exactly this, and found it to be less frightening than she'd anticipated. "Mrs. Dunn," Greaves said, leaning forward slightly, "you testified that Mrs. Moretti made decisions, but isn't it possible that what you observed was Mrs. Moretti communicating decisions that Mr. Moretti had already made and simply relayed through her?" Patricia Dunn looked at him over the top of her glasses. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "was not present for most of those conversations. He was frequently unavailable." The pause before unavailable was brief, but it was there, and the courtroom felt it. Greaves moved on quickly. After Patricia Dunn stepped down, Carla Voss said she had one more piece of evidence to introduce before the end of the day's session, and she said it in the same even tone she used for everything, which meant the room had no warning of what was coming. She asked the court's permission to play a video. Judge Dole granted it. The screen that had been positioned at the front of the courtroom, the same screen that had displayed the financial charts and bank records all morning, flickered once and resolved into surveillance footage. The timestamp in the corner read 18 months ago. The location was a hotel lobby in Miami. Damien saw it before anyone else in the room understood what they were looking at. The footage was clear, high definition, well lit, the kind of quality that came from a luxury hotel's security system. It showed him, unmistakably him, there was nothing to argue about, sitting in a corner of the lobby bar with Bianca. They were close together. Her hand was on his forearm. He was laughing at something she'd said, the kind of easy, unguarded laugh he had almost never produced in his adult life, and there was something nakedly private about it, something that made watching it feel intrusive in the worst way. But the footage wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that it was followed by 3 more clips. Different hotels, different cities, different months. The timestamps covered a span of 7 years. 7 years. Damien did not move. He did not look at Bianca. He looked at the screen with the fixed attention of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of something he walked into without seeing. From the gallery there was a sound, just barely audible, just a single sharp intake of breath. And it came from the direction where Damien's 2 children were seated. His son Marco, 20 years old, was in the second row of the gallery. His daughter Sophia, 17, sat beside him. They were there as observers, as Elena's attorney had arranged, because the judge had determined that their understanding of the proceedings was relevant to the custody determination. Marco had his mother's stillness and his father's jaw. Sophia had always been harder to read, a quality she'd inherited from no one in particular and developed entirely on her own. Damien had not looked at them since entering the courtroom that morning. He told himself it was strategic, that eye contact during proceedings could be used against you, that keeping his focus on the bench was the professional approach. The truth was simpler and more cowardly than that. He looked now. He couldn't stop himself. Marco was staring at the screen with an expression Damien had never seen on his son's face. Not anger exactly, not devastation, but something more unsettling than either. The specific look of a person who is watching a belief system collapse in real time and has not yet decided what to replace it with. Sophia had stopped watching the screen. She was looking at her hands in her lap. Her shoulders were slightly curved inward, the posture of someone making themselves small, and Damien felt something move through him that he had no name for and no defense against. He turned back to the front of the room. Greaves was already on his feet, challenging the admissibility of the surveillance footage, citing the chain of custody, questioning how the materials had been obtained, throwing every procedural argument available at a piece of evidence that was doing catastrophic damage with each second it remained on that screen. Judge Dole listened, asked 3 precise questions, and then ruled that the materials were admissible and that the court would take a 15-minute recess. The screen went dark. The room exhaled. Damien stood, and as he turned toward the side door that led to the private consultation room, he made the mistake of glancing toward Bianca. She was looking at him. Her face had changed. The confident, proprietary expression she'd worn all morning, The expression of a woman who believes she is watching a man demonstrate that she is worth choosing had been replaced by something more calculated, more private. She was doing math behind her eyes, and Damien, who had spent a lifetime reading people, read her with sudden and complete clarity. She was calculating what this outcome meant for her. Not for them. For her. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then looked away. In the consultation room, Greaves closed the door and turned around and said, "The footage. Tell me about the footage." "There's nothing to tell you that wasn't on that screen. 7 years, Damien. I know how long it was. The messages are going to follow. Whatever she has in texts and emails. After that footage, the judge will allow everything. Carla Voss just reframed this entire proceeding. We're not arguing about asset division anymore. We're arguing about character. And character—" Greaves stopped himself, ran a hand over his silver hair. "Character is going to be very hard to defend." Damien sat down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at them, a habit he'd developed years ago when he needed to think without showing that he was thinking. "The children," he said. Greaves was quiet. "Marcus saw that screen," Damien said. "Yes." "Sophia?" "Yes." Damien's hands pressed harder against the table. The knuckles whitened slightly. "What does that do to the custody argument?" "It severely complicates—" "What does it do?" Another silence. Longer. Greaves sat down across from him. "It probably ends it," he said quietly. "Not permanently. But in the immediate term, the judge is going to weight that footage heavily in terms of the domestic environment assessment. Elena's attorney is going to argue that the pattern of deception demonstrates a disregard for family stability, and the judge is—" He stopped again. "Margaret Dole has 3 grown daughters. I want you to understand what that means in terms of how she's processing what just played on that screen." Damien said nothing. "We can fight the asset division," Greaves continued. "We have legitimate grounds on the business contribution question. It's not airtight, but it's— How much are we going to lose?" Greaves opened his mouth and closed it again. "Estimate," Damien said. 40 to 60% of the legitimate portfolio, depending on how the judge values the early contribution in context of 40 to 60%. Yes, the number sat there between them. 40 to 60% of a legitimate portfolio that was worth, depending on how you valued the current real estate holdings, somewhere between $3 and $4 billion. That was real money even for Damien Moretti. That was not an abstraction, but it was not what was sitting behind his eyes right now. What was sitting behind his eyes was the image of Sophia with her shoulders curved inward and her hands in her lap, making herself small on a hard courtroom bench, while her father's 7-year infidelity played out on a screen 6 feet in front of her. He stood up abruptly. "I need a minute," he said. "Damien, we don't have—" "1 minute, Paul." He walked to the window. Different window than the morning's, same gray Manhattan sky. The city didn't care. The city had seen worse than this on any given Tuesday afternoon and would see worse again by Friday. He thought about Elena at that kitchen table in February, the cup of tea, the flatness in her voice. "I know about Bianca." He'd looked at her across that kitchen island, the same kitchen where Sophia had learned to bake and where Marco had done his homework for a decade and where Elena had stood every morning of their married life, making coffee before anyone else was awake. And he'd felt nothing except the vague inconvenience of being caught. He'd felt the logistics of the situation arranging themselves in his mind. The lawyers, the asset protection strategies, the narrative management. He hadn't felt anything about her. He understood now, standing at this window, that this said something about him that no amount of strategic legal maneuvering could change. There was a knock at the door. His security. "Mr. Moretti, 2 minutes." He turned from the window. Greaves was watching him with the careful expression of a man who has delivered very bad news to very powerful people and developed a professional sensitivity for the unpredictable ways they respond. "We go back in," Damien said. "Yes." "We fight every piece of it." "Yes." "And the children—" He stopped, recalibrated. His voice, when he continued, was lower and stripped of the authority it usually carried, which was the closest thing to vulnerability Greaves had ever heard from him. "Is there anything we can do? Anything at all?" Greaves looked at him for a long moment. "Be honest with the judge," he said. "When she addresses the custody question directly, Don't perform. Don't give her the polished version. She's seen 1,000 polished versions. She'll respond to something real. Damien almost laughed. The sound that came out instead was something shorter and harder. Real, he repeated, like it was a word in a language he'd never fully learned. He walked back into the courtroom. The afternoon continued with Elena's attorney introducing the private message documentation, a carefully curated selection from what Carla Voss described to the judge as a larger archive of communications between Damien and Bianca spanning from 2015 to the present. She did not read them aloud. She submitted them into evidence and allowed Judge Dole to review them directly, which in some ways was worse than a public reading. It left the imagination to do the work, and imagination is rarely charitable. Elena sat through this with the same stillness she'd had all day. She did not look at the messages as they were submitted. She did not look at Damien. She looked at a fixed point somewhere above the judge's bench, and she kept her hands folded and she breathed evenly. And Damien, watching her from across the room, recognized with something approaching awe that she had spent months preparing not just legally but emotionally, that she had arrived at this courtroom having already processed everything, having already moved through the worst of it, having done the work before the day arrived so that this day could not break her. He hadn't done any of that work. He'd spent 11 months building defenses. She'd spent 11 months building herself. When the session ended for the day at 4:45, Damien stood and gathered nothing because he had brought nothing, and turned toward the side exit, and that was when he heard his son's voice. "Dad!" Marco was standing at the edge of the gallery with his coat over his arm, and he was looking at his father with those flat gray eyes that were so similar to Damien's own that looking at them had always been slightly disconcerting. Damien stopped. The security detail moved subtly closer, which was automatic, and which Marco noticed with a brief glance of distaste. "It's fine," Damien said quietly, and the security team stepped back. Father and son stood 6 feet apart in the emptying courtroom. Somewhere in the background, Elena was speaking quietly with her attorney, not looking over. Sophia had already left with Elena's assistant. She'd walked out during the recess and not come back. 7 years, Marco said. Damien said nothing. "I did the math while they were talking." Marco's voice was very controlled in the way that Damien recognized. It was the control of someone who is not calm, who is the opposite of calm, who is holding something back through sheer force of will. "I was 13 when it started. Sophia was 10. The number landed. Damien met his son's eyes. "You don't have to do this here," Damien said, not dismissively, just the only thing he had. "Where then?" Marco said. "In one of your offices? One of the hotels?" He stopped himself. His jaw worked. "She never said anything to us. You know that. Not one word. She just kept things running. She just kept our lives normal while you were—" He shook his head. The control was slipping at the edges. "Do you have any idea what that cost her?" Damien's voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been all day. "Yes," he said. Marco looked at him for a long moment, searching for something. Not an excuse, Damien understood, but something real, something true, some evidence that the man standing in front of him was capable of understanding what he'd done. What he found in his father's face, he kept to himself. He picked up his coat, turned to go. "Marco." His son stopped, didn't turn around. Damien opened his mouth and closed it. He had, in his life, given orders that moved money and men and outcomes. He had negotiated in rooms where the wrong word could end badly for everyone present. He had never once been at a loss for what to say when it mattered. He was at a loss now. "I'm sorry" seemed grotesquely inadequate, and also the only true thing available. He said it anyway. Marco stood with his back to his father for 3 full seconds. Then he walked out without answering, and the door swung shut behind him. And the sound of it was not loud, but it was final, in a way that Damien felt somewhere specific inside his chest that he would not have been able to locate on a diagram. He stood in the emptying courtroom alone. Outside, he could hear Bianca somewhere down the hallway, her voice raised slightly, speaking to someone on her phone with that particular edge she used when she was performing impatience. In a few minutes, she would find him and take his arm and say something designed to demonstrate that she was on his side, that they were a unit, that today was just a setback on the way to a victory that was still coming. She would do this because that was what she did, and because she still believed, just barely, but still, that the outcome would leave her standing somewhere comfortable. Damien walked toward the exit. He did not wait for her. He walked past her in the hallway without breaking stride, and when she turned and said his name sharply, he kept walking, out through the courthouse doors and down the marble steps and into the cold, late afternoon air where his Escalade was waiting. And he got in and closed the door and sat in the back seat in silence as the city moved past the dark windows. His phone had 19 notifications. He left it in his pocket. He thought about Sophia with her hands in her lap. He thought about Marco's voice saying she just kept our lives normal. He thought about Elena at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, sitting in the dark with a cup of tea alone, having already decided what she was going to do. He thought about the fact that he had lived with a woman for 23 years and created 2 human beings with her and built a fortune beside her and apparently understood none of it, none of her, none of what it had cost. And the evidence for this was comprehensive and admissible, and had been displayed on a screen in front of a judge and his children this afternoon, and there was not a single argument left that pushed back against it. The car moved through Manhattan, and Damien Moretti, who had never in his adult life been truly afraid, felt the specific fear of a man who has looked at the wreckage of his own choices and cannot find a single piece of it that he can blame on someone else. And somewhere across the city, in a quieter car moving toward a house that she had maintained and kept and made into something whole, Elena Moretti looked out her own window at the same darkening skyline and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the faint and terrifying sensation of something lifting. The next morning, Carla Voss would walk into that courtroom with one final witness, a name that Damien's team had not seen in any filing, had not prepared for, had not even considered possible. And by the time that witness finished speaking, there would be nothing left to fight over except the size of what Damien had already lost. The witness's name was Vincent Caruso. Damien didn't recognize it at first. Carla Voss announced the name to the courtroom at 9:17 in the morning, and for approximately 3 seconds, Damien sat with the mild alert attention of a man cataloging an unfamiliar variable, running it against his internal database of known threats, and finding nothing. Then Greaves leaned sideways and said very quietly, directly into Damien's ear, "That's your former CFO." The air left the room. Not literally. The room was exactly as it had been. Same gray morning light through the same high windows, same ambient noise of papers shuffling and chairs shifting, same flat institutional smell of carpet and old wood. But something in Damien's perception of the room changed in that 3-second window with the specific, irreversible quality of a door closing behind you in a place you cannot leave. Vincent Caruso had been the chief financial officer of Moretti Holdings from 2007 to 2019. He was 58 years old, Italian-American, originally from the Bronx, the kind of accountant who understood that the men who hired him were not always interested in conventional financial management, and who had, over 12 years, demonstrated a reliable talent for making numbers say whatever the situation required. He had been compensated extraordinarily well for this talent. He had also been present in various capacities for decisions and arrangements that existed in the space between the legitimate and the not. And Damien had operated for years on the understanding that Vincent Caruso's silence was guaranteed by the simple arithmetic of mutual destruction. If Caruso talked, Damien went down. But if Caruso talked, Caruso went down too. That arithmetic had always been sufficient. Until this morning, Damien had never had reason to question it. Vincent Caruso walked to the witness stand with the careful movements of a man who has made a decision he knows he cannot unmake, and has resolved to carry it through without flinching. He was heavier than Damien remembered, grayer, and he wore a suit that was good, but not as good as the suits he'd worn when Moretti money was paying for his wardrobe. He settled into the chair and folded his hands on the railing and looked at Carla Voss with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment so many times that the rehearsal has become indistinguishable from the thing itself. Greaves was already on his feet. "Your Honor, the defense was not notified of this witness. We have not had the opportunity to depose Mr. Greaves." Judge Dole's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. Mr. Caruso was listed in the supplemental filing submitted to the court and to opposing counsel 10 days ago. If you'd like to address that filing now, I'm prepared to hear it. Greaves said nothing. Because the supplemental filing had been received. Damien knew this because Greaves had mentioned it in passing. A supplemental witness list, potentially a character witness, or a financial consultant, nothing to prioritize. He had not investigated it. He had been occupied with other strategies, other angles, other fires. He had not investigated it because Vincent Caruso was supposed to be untouchable. A locked door. A wall that did not require monitoring because everyone understood it would not move. Judge Dole looked at Greaves. "Are we proceeding?" she asked. Greaves sat down. Carla Voss approached the witness stand with a yellow legal pad and the unhurried deliberateness that Damien had come to understand was her tell. She moved slowly when she was most certain, when she knew exactly what was coming and was simply managing the pace at which it arrived. "Mr. Caruso," she began, "can you describe your professional relationship with Damien Moretti?" What followed was 40 minutes of testimony that did not merely complicate the divorce proceedings. It detonated them. Caruso spoke clearly, methodically, with the practiced precision of a man who has either worked extensively with a prosecutor's office or deeply wishes the judge to believe he has. He described, in specific and documented detail, a series of financial arrangements within the Moretti Holdings structure that had been designed to reduce the apparent value of the legitimate business portfolio. The specific portfolio that was now at the center of the asset division dispute. Shell accounts, deferred revenue structures, artificially depreciated property valuations, intercompany loans recorded at terms that bore no relationship to their actual economic function. The mechanisms were sophisticated, and they had been constructed, Caruso testified, with the explicit goal of making the legitimate estate appear worth substantially less than it was. Not to deceive the government, though that was a secondary consequence that was now a problem for a different legal proceeding. The immediate goal, Caruso testified, had been to deceive Elena. The silence in the courtroom was the kind that has weight. Judge Dole's pen, which had been moving steadily across her notepad for most of the morning, stopped. Carla Voss let the silence sit for a measured moment before she asked her next question. "And when were these structures put in place?" Caruso adjusted his position in the chair. His hands remained folded. "The initial arrangements were made in early 2022, he said, approximately 6 weeks after Mrs. Moretti filed for divorce." Greaves stood again, objection already forming, and Damien caught his arm without looking at him. A single hand on the sleeve, no pressure, no words. Greaves stopped, sat, because Damien understood in this moment, with absolute clarity, that objections were no longer relevant. You don't object to an avalanche, you just experience it. He sat very still and experienced it. Caruso continued. The structures had been his design, commissioned by Damien and executed through a network of subsidiary accounts that had been deliberately obscured in the documentation provided to Elena's legal team during discovery. Caruso had prepared false valuations. He had signed off on depreciation schedules that bore no relationship to actual asset values. He had participated in a coordinated effort to ensure that whatever Elena was ultimately awarded would represent a fraction of what she was legally entitled to. He had done all of this, he said, and here his voice shifted almost imperceptibly, carrying a new note that might have been called guilt, or might more accurately have been called the sound of a man buying himself a specific kind of insurance, because he had been told that Elena's award would be used to justify reductions in the children's long-term financial arrangements as well. He had not been comfortable with that. The children. Damien's hands, both of them, were pressed flat against the table now. The pressure was constant and invisible to anyone watching. Inside his chest, something was occurring that he had no physiological vocabulary for, something that was not quite breathlessness, but was adjacent to it, a kind of systemic shutdown working inward from the edges. He had not known, he had not calculated, that Caruso would bring the children into it. He had not known that this would be the detail that finally broke through whatever was left of his composure. In the gallery, Marco had gone very still. The gray eyes that were so like his father's were fixed on the witness stand with an expression that had moved beyond the controlled fury of yesterday into something colder and more permanent, something that looked less like anger and more like the final stages of a long belief collapsing into rubble. Sophia was not there. She had stopped attending after the second day, which was its own sentence. Greaves cross-examined Caruso for an hour and 15 minutes, and it was the most technically aggressive cross-examination Damien had witnessed in a career spent in and around courtrooms. Greaves attacked Caruso's credibility, his motivations, his potential cooperation agreements with prosecutors, the reliability of his documentation, the the distinction between following instructions and having independent knowledge of intent. He was brilliant and thorough, and he made approximately 4 legitimate points that would require the court to weigh Caruso's testimony carefully. None of it mattered. The documentation Caruso had brought was physical. Original files, not copies. Emails with Damien's address in the header, time-stamped, authenticated by metadata that Greaves's own experts would later be unable to credibly dispute. Spreadsheets in Caruso's handwriting with margin notes that correlated precisely to the structures he'd described. The kind of evidence that doesn't require a credible witness because it carries its own credibility, because it is simply a thing that exists in the world and cannot be argued out of existence by a skilled attorney, no matter how skilled that attorney is. When the court recessed at 12:45, Damien did not go to the consultation room. He walked out a side exit and found a stairwell and went up 2 flights to a landing where there was nothing except a window overlooking an air shaft and the sound of the building's ventilation system. He stood there. His security detail waited at the bottom of the stairs. Greaves came up after 3 minutes, which was faster than Damien had wanted, but about what he'd expected. Greaves stood on the landing and looked at him. "You didn't tell me about the structures," Greaves said. Not accusatory, just stating a coordinate. "No. You didn't tell me because you knew I wouldn't have." "I didn't tell you because I didn't think it would come out." Damien's voice was flat. "Caruso had as much to lose as I did." "What changed?" Damien thought about this. His hands were in his pockets. He was looking at the air shaft. "I don't know," he said, which was the truth, and which was one of the most disorienting things he'd said in years because Damien Moretti always knew. He always knew the angles, the motivations, the vectors. That was what he did. That was what he was. "He has a cooperation deal," Greaves said. "Has to. The documentation he walked in with, the level of preparation. Someone in a prosecutor's office sat with him. This didn't come from nowhere. Elena's attorney. Carla Voss doesn't have prosecutorial authority, but she has connections, and she has..." Greaves stopped, started again. "He's protected. Whatever you might consider doing, he's protected." Damien looked at him. "I'm not going to do anything to Vincent Caruso," he said. Greaves held his gaze. "I know that." "Do you?" A pause. "Yes," Greaves said, with slightly more certainty this time, "because you're sitting in a courthouse in the middle of a proceeding that is already catastrophic, and because whatever you were 20 years ago, you are not stupid." The word 20 years ago landed in the stairwell, and neither of them addressed it. "What's the damage?" Damien said. Greaves had a yellow pad. He'd been running numbers since Caruso started talking. The asset concealment changes everything. The judge has discretion to penalize deliberate concealment with an enhanced award, not just 50% of the actual portfolio value, but potentially more depending on how she weighs the deception. The children's custody determination is now effectively a foregone conclusion. Elena gets primary custody. You get supervised visitation until you can demonstrate to the court's satisfaction. He stopped. The legitimate portfolio, the real value, is somewhere between 3.2 and 3.8 billion. After Caruso's testimony, you're looking at losing 60 to 70% rather than 50, possibly more. Damien nodded once. "There's also," Greaves said carefully, "the separate question of what the prosecutor's office does with Caruso's documentation. What he described this morning, the false valuations, the concealment structures, those aren't civil matters exclusively. The implication sat between them. Timeline, Damien said. Unknown. Could be months. Could be longer. But it's coming." Damien nodded again. He felt very tired. Not the tiredness of a bad night's sleep, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been operating at maximum intensity for a very long time and has just encountered the wall at the end of the corridor. "I need you to do one thing," he said. "What?" "The children's trust. Whatever Elena's attorney moves to restructure, whatever the court reorders, I want the children's trust left intact. Whatever she's owed from the marital estate, fine. But the trust I set up for Marco and Sophia in 2015, that's separate. That's theirs. That doesn't get touched." Greaves looked at him. Something shifted in the attorney's expression. Not softness exactly, but a recognition of something. "I can make that argument," he said. "Make it," Damien said. "That's the one thing I need from this." He walked back down the stairs. The afternoon session was the one that finished it. Judge Dole reconvened the court at 2 o'clock and proceeded with the methodical efficiency of a jurist who has reached her conclusions and is now building the public record that supports them. She allowed Carla Voss to complete the evidentiary presentation, which included 3 more witnesses: a property appraiser who testified to the discrepancy between Caruso's recorded valuations and actual market values, a banking consultant who walked through the shell account structures in language the court reporter could follow, and finally, briefly, Elena herself. Elena took the stand for 40 minutes. She did not cry. She did not perform. She answered every question in a voice that was level and precise, and the picture she drew was not of a woman who had been victimized, not the language of helplessness, not the vocabulary of suffering, but of a woman who had made choices, hard choices, informed choices, and who was now simply asking the court to recognize what those choices had built and what she was owed for having built it. She was asked about the children. She said that Marco and Sofia were resilient. She said they were intelligent and loving and that they would be fine, because she intended to make sure they were fine and because they had each other. She said she did not ask the court to punish their father beyond what the evidence demanded, because punishing their father further would not improve her children's lives, and her children's lives were the only outcome that actually mattered to her. Greaves declined to cross-examine. When Elena stepped down from the stand and walked back to her table, she passed within 8 feet of where Damien was sitting, and for the first and only time that day she looked directly at him. Not with triumph, not with anger, just with a clear and level attention that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before she turned away. In those 2 seconds, Damien saw something in her face that he had not expected and could not have prepared for: the absence of anything that required him. Not indifference. Indifference still has a relationship to the person you're indifferent toward. This was different. This was the face of a woman who had already reorganized the interior of her life and discovered that the space he had occupied had been filled with something else, something better, and that she was simply moving forward now through a world in which he was a peripheral figure with whom she had unfinished legal business. It was the most devastating thing he had ever seen. Closing arguments took the rest of the afternoon. Greaves was extraordinary. He found every remaining thread and pulled it with precision, built the most coherent possible case from the wreckage available, and delivered a closing that 3 weeks ago might have meant something. Carla Voss spoke for 11 minutes. She summarized the record. She said the evidence speaks for itself and sat down. Judge Dole said she would deliberate and return her preliminary ruling within 2 weeks, which was faster than anyone had anticipated and which told every lawyer in the room exactly where she'd landed. The session ended. People stood. Paper shuffled. The gallery emptied in the particular haphazard way of courtrooms at the end of long days. Damien sat. He sat for a full minute after the room had mostly cleared, and during that minute Greaves waited beside him without speaking because he had the intelligence to understand that this was not a moment for strategy or next steps or the management of outcomes. This was something else. This was a man sitting in the ruins of a version of himself. Then, from behind him, from the gallery, came the sound of a single set of footsteps. He turned. Bianca was standing at the rail. She had her coat over her arm and her bag on her shoulder, and her expression was composed in a way that required visible effort. She looked like a woman who has decided what she needs to say and is waiting for the correct moment to say it, which meant she had already made a decision, and this conversation was its notification, not its negotiation. "I think," she said, "we need to talk." Damien looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Not here." "No." She nodded once, turned, and walked toward the door. Her heels on the courthouse floor were very loud in the emptied room. Damien watched her go, and he noticed, in the way you notice small details when larger systems are shutting down, that she did not look back to see if he was following. She already knew he would. That was the thing about Bianca. She'd always known which direction he'd move. She'd built her position in his life on that knowledge, on the reliable geography of his choices, and she had been right about him for 7 years. He stood, buttoned his jacket, looked at Greaves. "I'll call you tomorrow," he said. Greaves nodded. "Damien?" He paused. "Whatever happens in the next few days, don't make it worse." Damien said nothing. He walked toward the door. He found Bianca in a town car she'd arranged herself, parked half a block from the courthouse. He got in. The car was warm and it smelled like her perfume, and for a moment the familiarity of it was almost physical, like a room you've spent so much time in that your body relaxes before your mind decides to. She was looking out the window when he got in. She turned to face him. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know. The thing with Caruso. I know what you're going to say." She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. She was not a woman who enjoyed being interrupted, which was something they'd negotiated over 7 years without ever quite resolving. "Then say it," she said. He looked at her. The afternoon light was going sideways through the car window, catching the angles of her face. She was beautiful. She had always been genuinely beautiful, and he had never confused that beauty with something it wasn't, with depth or loyalty, or the willingness to be present when presence was inconvenient. He had always known what she was. He had chosen her anyway, which said something about what he'd been willing to settle for when something real was available, and he was too arrogant to protect it. "You're leaving," he said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. "The situation has changed," she said. "The situation has changed," he repeated. No sarcasm, no anger, just the words. "I'm not built for—" She stopped. Tried a different angle. "What's coming, Damien? The legal exposure, the asset restructuring, the thing with the prosecutors that Paul obviously told you about? I'm not—" She pressed her lips together. "I never signed up for that." "No," he said. "You signed up for the other thing." She met his eyes, held them. "Yes," she said, and there was something almost like honesty in it, which was more than he'd expected from her, which probably said something about how low his expectations had gotten. He nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Take what you need from the apartment. I'll have security." "I already have what I need," she said, and the speed of that answer told him everything about how long she'd been planning this particular exit. He got out of the car. He stood on the sidewalk as it pulled away, and he watched until it turned a corner and disappeared, and then he stood there for a moment longer in the cold air, with the city moving around him like he was a rock in a river, everything flowing past, indifferent. His phone buzzed. A message from Marco. 2 words. "We need to talk." Not a question, not a request. A statement that had the weight of something that had been decided by someone who had looked at his father clearly, without illusion, and was still, despite everything, choosing to move toward rather than away. Damien read the message 3 times. He put the phone in his pocket. He started walking. He had no destination and no strategy and no script for what came next, and no version of himself available that he trusted to navigate it. And for the first time in 23 years, Damien Moretti, the man who had ruled New York by knowing every angle before anyone else did, walked into the evening with absolutely no idea what he was doing, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him that had been true in a very long time, and which was the only possible beginning of something that might, eventually, if he was capable of it, deserve to be called change. Marco had chosen a diner, not a restaurant. A diner. The kind with laminate countertops and coffee that came in a white ceramic mug without anyone asking if you wanted it, just appeared because you were there and it was cold outside, and that was the implicit agreement between the place and anyone who walked through its door. It was 11 blocks from the courthouse, in a neighborhood that had no relationship to either the Moretti name or the life that name represented. Plastic boots. A jukebox that hadn't worked in 6 years. The smell of bacon grease and industrial cleaner, and something underneath both of those that was just the smell of a place that had been feeding tired people for a very long time. Damien walked in at 7:15. Marco was already there. Back booth, facing the door. A habit he'd developed so young that Damien could no longer remember whether he'd taught it to him deliberately or whether his son had simply absorbed it from watching his father move through the world. The boy had his mother's stillness and his father's eyes and a cup of black coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. Damien slid into the booth across from him. A waitress materialized, poured coffee without asking, disappeared. The diner was half full, low murmur of other people's conversations, the distant clatter of the kitchen. Nobody looked at them. Nobody knew who they were here. That was why Marco had chosen it. They sat across from each other for a moment without speaking. Damien looked at his son's face, really looked at it, without the courtroom tension, without the performance of composure, and what he saw was exhaustion. Not the dramatic exhaustion of crisis, but something deeper and more chronic, The specific fatigue of a young man who had spent years managing his understanding of his father against an increasingly difficult body of evidence, and had finally, yesterday, run out of the energy required to keep managing it. "You walked here?" Marco said. "Part of the way." His son looked at him. "It's 31 degrees. "I know." A pause. "Where's your security?" Marco said. "I told them to give me an hour." Marco's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not... You know that's not... Marco." Damien wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. The heat was immediate and grounding. "I'm not discussing security with you right now." His son looked at the table, looked back up. "Okay," he said. "Then what are we discussing?" Damien had walked 11 blocks in 31-degree weather with no particular plan for this conversation, which was itself a statement about where he was, because Damien Moretti did not enter conversations unprepared. He had entered every significant conversation of his adult life, knowing what he needed from the other person and the most efficient route to getting it. He had mapped dialogues the way other men mapped roads, understood the terrain before he arrived, placed his words where they would do the most work. He had nothing tonight. He was just a man sitting across from his son in a diner that smelled like bacon grease, with cold still coming off his jacket and no strategy available. "I need you to understand some things," Damien said. Marco waited. "Not because understanding them changes what I did. They don't. What I did is what it is, and I'm not going to sit here and... I'm not going to do that." He stopped, started again. "But there are things that are about to happen legally, beyond the divorce, and you and Sophia need to be prepared for them." Marco's eyes sharpened. "What things?" "The financial structures Caruso described today. There are going to be federal implications. Your mother's attorneys may have coordinated with the prosecutor's office. I don't know the extent of it yet. But there's going to be an investigation." He said it flatly, without drama. "A coordinate. A fact to be incorporated. It won't touch your mother. Her involvement in the legitimate businesses was operational, not structural. She didn't know about the concealment arrangements. She's clean. And you?" Damien looked at his coffee. "And me," he said. Marco sat back against the booth. He pressed one hand flat against the laminate table in a gesture so reminiscent of his father's own unconscious habit that it landed somewhere painful in Damien's chest. "How bad?" Marco said. There it was. His own question, coming back from his own son, in almost his own words. The family vocabulary of catastrophe. "Manageable," Damien said, "with the right representation. Nothing that will... It's civil exposure primarily, with potential criminal components that are defensible. I'm not going to prison, Marco." "Are you sure?" "Yes." A silence. The kitchen clattered. Someone near the front of the diner laughed at something, the sound too loud and too bright for the room. "Sophia doesn't know any of this," Marco said. "I know. She's 17. I know how old she is. She cried last night." Marco's voice didn't change when he said it, which was somehow worse than if it had. "In her room, after Mom went to sleep. I could hear her through the wall. She was trying to be quiet about it." He stopped. "She's been trying to be quiet about everything for the last 4 months because she doesn't want to make it worse for Mom." Damien said nothing. "She's 17 years old," Marco said again, "and she's managing her grief to protect her mother, and I need you to understand that. I need you to understand what the choices you made did to a 17-year-old girl who used to think you were the most important person in the world." The words went in without resistance. Damien had no resistance left. He sat with them the way you sit with something that's going to hurt for a very long time. And there is no alternative to simply letting it hurt. "I know," he said. "Do you?" Marco said, and there was an edge in it now, the controlled fury cracking at the seam. "Because you walked into that courthouse yesterday morning with your hand on that woman's back like it was a press conference, like we were going to read about it in the papers, and that was fine, like we were going to see it on the news, and that was just..." He stopped himself, both hands on the table now, pressed flat, the knuckles pale. "We were there, Dad. We were sitting in that room." "I know. Stop saying that. What do you want me to say? Something real." Marco's voice cracked on the last word, just barely, just for a moment before he pulled it back. He was 20 years old and he was trying very hard to be harder than he was, and Damien recognized the effort because he had spent 30 years making the same effort and knew exactly where it led. For once in your life, say something that isn't managed, that isn't you walking into the room already knowing what the room needs from you. Damien looked at his son. He thought about everything he could say. The apologies, the explanations, the context, the long history of a marriage that had curdled slowly over years through a combination of arrogance and neglect, and the particular blindness of a man who had always been the most powerful person in any room and had confused that power with being right. None of it was what Marco was asking for. "I was afraid of your mother," Damien said. Marco blinked. Not physically, not that way. Damien looked down at his coffee. "She saw me. From the beginning, when I was nobody. When I was building something out of nothing and lying about what that nothing looked like. She saw exactly what I was. And she stayed. And that..." He stopped. "That was terrifying, because I understood that if she stayed knowing what she knew, then I was responsible for her in a way I couldn't manage like I managed everything else. I couldn't outmaneuver it. I couldn't handle it." He looked up. "So I made it smaller. I made her smaller. I convinced myself she was infrastructure, that she was background, that she was the thing the empire ran on top of, not the thing that made it possible." He pressed his lips together. "And I found someone who didn't know what I was. Someone I could perform for instead of being accountable to." The diner hummed around them. A truck went past outside, the vibration moving through the floor briefly. Marco was looking at his father with an expression that was no longer just anger. There was something else in it now, something more complicated that didn't have a single name. The look of a person encountering an unexpected truth about someone they'd already decided to be finished with and discovering that the decision was more difficult than it had felt. "That doesn't fix it," Marco said. "I know that. It doesn't change what Sophia heard yesterday. I know. Or what Mom had to sit through in that courtroom." "Marco," Damien's voice was very quiet. I know all of it. I'm not telling you this to fix it. You asked me to say something real. That's real." His son sat with it. A minute passed, maybe more. The waitress came by, refilled their cups without being asked, moved on. "The trust," Marco finally said, "the one from 2015. It's intact. It's not part of the marital estate. Greaves is filing to protect it from the asset ruling tomorrow morning. Mom's attorney is going to challenge it. Probably. We'll argue it. It'll hold. The structure is clean. It predates the concealment arrangements, and it was always designated as the children's independent assets." Damien looked at him. "That money is yours and Sophia's. Whatever happens to everything else, that doesn't move." Marco nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup for the first time and held it without drinking. "I'm not forgiving you," he said. "Not tonight. Not..." He shook his head. "I don't know when. Maybe not for a long time." "Okay. But I'm also not..." He stopped. Set the cup down. "I'm not walking away completely. I'm not doing that to Sophia. She needs..." He stopped again, as if he was deciding in real time how much to give. "She asked about you this morning, before the session. She said she wanted to know if you were okay." The specific texture of that sentence, the 17-year-old girl who had cried quietly through the wall the night before asking whether her father was okay, moved through Damien's chest like something physical. He nodded once. He didn't trust his voice. "I'll tell her you are," Marco said, "whether it's true or not." "Tell her it's getting there," Damien said. His son looked at him for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached across the laminate table and gripped his father's forearm once, briefly, with both hands. Not a hug, not an absolution, something more functional and precise. The gesture of a young man who has decided to hold a thread rather than cut it entirely. Then he let go, picked up his jacket, left enough cash on the table for both coffees. "I'll be in touch," he said. He walked out. Damien sat alone at the booth for a long time after the door closed behind his son. He looked at the 2 coffee cups on the laminate table and the money Marco had left and the jukebox against the wall that didn't work anymore, and the window with its view of a sidewalk where people walked past in the cold without looking in. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Greaves. He let it ring. It buzzed again immediately. Not Greaves this time, a number he didn't recognize, which in his experience had a very specific range of meanings. He answered. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, professionally pleasant in the way of people who communicate bad news for a living. "Mr. Moretti, my name is Richard Soames. I'm a special agent with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. I've been trying to reach your attorney, but I thought it might be appropriate to give you a personal courtesy call to let you know that we'll be requesting a voluntary interview in the next 10 to 14 days. Nothing you need to respond to tonight, just so you're not surprised." Damien looked at the window. "Thank you," he said, because there was nothing else to say. "Have a good evening, sir." The call ended. He sat for another moment. The kitchen clattered. The diner hummed. Outside, New York went about its business with the vast indifference of a city that has absorbed the rises and falls of 10,000 men like Damien Moretti and remembers none of them. He left the diner at 8:40. What happened next came from a direction no one had anticipated, least of all Damien. He had been in the car for 4 minutes, headed back toward the hotel, when his phone rang again. This time it was a number he recognized immediately. The personal cell of a man named Frank Del Vecchio, who ran the Del Vecchio Group, a real estate investment firm that operated out of offices in Midtown, and whose relationship with the Moretti organization was long, layered, and not entirely confined to legitimate business activity. Frank Del Vecchio was 64 years old, had been an ally of Damien's since 2004, and had not called Damien's personal number in 3 years. In the hierarchy of signals this represented, it sat somewhere between concerning and alarming. "Frank?" Damien said. "Damien." A pause. The kind of pause that is itself a communication. "You need to come by. Tonight." "It's past 8. I know what time it is." Damien looked at the back of the driver's headrest. His security lead, positioned in the passenger seat, was already watching him in the mirror with the alert stillness of someone who has registered that the call is not routine. "What's this about, Frank?" "Not on the phone." Another pause. "It's about the Santoro situation." "The Santoro situation." Damien's hand tightened on the phone by a fraction of an inch. The Santoro situation was not a situation anyone had called by that name in 8 months, because 8 months ago the Santoro situation had appeared to be resolved. The Santoro situation involved a territory dispute with the Santoro family, one of the younger, more aggressive organizations that had been expanding their position in the city in the last 4 years. Testing the borders of older arrangements, seeing where the pressure points were in an empire that, as everyone in certain circles was beginning to understand, was showing cracks. The Santoro situation had appeared resolved because, in February, 3 of the Santoro organization's senior people had very quietly made overtures through intermediaries, suggesting a willingness to de-escalate in exchange for certain territorial accommodations in 2 specific neighborhoods in Queens. The accommodations were agreed to. The de-escalation had appeared to hold. Appeared. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Damien said. He ended the call. Looked at his security lead. "Change of plans," he said. The Del Vecchio Group's offices were in a building on West 47th Street that was legitimate from the lobby to the 14th floor, and somewhat less so on the 15th, which was where Frank Del Vecchio's private office was located, and where, when Damien arrived at 8:58, he found Frank and 3 other men whose presence told him immediately that whatever was happening was worse than a phone call had been equipped to convey. Frank Del Vecchio was a heavy-set man with the kind of face that had been amiable once and had gradually reorganized itself around years of difficult decisions into something harder to read. He was sitting behind his desk, and he was not offering drinks, which was its own signal. The other 3 men, Tony Ricci, who managed Moretti Holdings' physical security operations, and who had been with Damien for 16 years, a man named Carroll, who Damien knew by sight as one of Frank's senior lieutenants, and a 4th man Damien didn't recognize, younger, maybe 35, with the flat, calm eyes of someone who delivers information professionally and has learned not to be personally involved in how it's received. Damien took the chair across from Frank's desk without being asked. His security lead positioned himself at the door and stayed there. "Tell me," Damien said. Frank looked at the 4th man. The 4th man opened a folder on his knee. He had the precise movements of someone trained in surveillance or intelligence, economy of motion, nothing wasted. 3 days ago, he began, there was a meeting in Brooklyn. Red Hook. The participants were 2 senior representatives of the Santoro organization, and he paused, just briefly, a fraction of a second. Vincent Caruso. The room was very quiet. Damien's face did not change. Caruso met with the Santoros, he said. Yes. 3 days ago, before he testified. The day before, Damien looked at Frank. Frank looked back at him with an expression of someone who has known a man for 20 years and is watching him process information that is changing the shape of everything. The Santoros approached Caruso, Damien said. Not a question. Working it through out loud. We believe so, the fourth man said. The de-escalation agreement from February, it was conditioned, in part, on the understanding that the Moretti organization's financial position remained sufficient to maintain certain arrangements. The divorce proceedings have been public. The asset exposure has been... They moved on it, Damien said. Yes. They found Caruso and they moved on it. They offered him protection in exchange for the testimony. We believe the prosecution cooperation was already in motion independently. The Santoros... The fourth man paused. The Santoros appear to have learned about Caruso's cooperation and used it, added to it. The meeting 3 days ago, based on what our source was able to obtain, concerned the Queen's territories. Specifically, what those territories look like in the event of a significant reduction in Moretti organizational capacity. Damien sat very still. Tony Ricci, from his position against the wall, said quietly, They're not waiting for the ruling, Damien. They're acting on the assumption that the ruling is going to go the way it looks like it's going to go. They're already moving people into the border areas. Frank leaned forward. His hands were flat on the desk. The divorce cost you half the legitimate portfolio. The federal investigation cost you the other arrangements. The Santoros know that. They've been patient for 4 years watching you, and now they've decided the window is open. He stopped. If you don't respond in the next 72 hours, the message it sends is that the window isn't just open, it's that there's no one home anymore. Damien looked at Frank Del Vecchio for a long moment. He thought about Marco in the diner, the hand on his forearm, the thread that his son had decided to hold rather than cut. He thought about Sophia asking whether he was okay. He thought about what a response in the next 72 hours would require, what it would look like, what it would cost. Not in money, in the other currency, the one that had no legal tender value but had always been the actual medium of exchange in the world he'd built his life inside. If he responded the way the situation had always required responding, he would be protecting an empire. He would be sending the necessary message. He would be the man who ruled New York, still standing, still feared, still functioning. He would also be, with absolute certainty, destroying every remaining thread that connected him to his children. Because Marco and Sophia were watching now. They were watching everything. And if he responded the way this world demanded, there would be nothing left to say to either of them that wasn't a lie. And he was no longer capable of sustaining the lies with the energy they required. He looked at the fourth man, at Carol, at Tony Ricci. He looked at Frank. How many people do the Santoros have in the border areas right now? He said. Tony answered. 8, maybe 10. Armed. Presumably. And their leadership. Where is Sal Santoro tonight? His club in Astoria, most likely. He's there most nights. Damien nodded. He looked at the window behind Frank's desk, the midtown skyline visible through it. The city that had been his for 20 years and was, piece by piece, being taken from him by consequences he had manufactured himself with the same hands he'd used to build everything. He thought about walking out of this room and making the call that stopped the Santoros. The clean, decisive call. The one that said the window was not open. That said whatever the courtroom had done, whatever the federal investigators were preparing, whatever Bianca had decided, that none of it had changed the fundamental geography of power in this city. He could make that call. Or he could do the other thing, the harder thing, the thing that had no precedent in his life and no roadmap and no guarantee of any outcome except the possibility, not the certainty, just the possibility, that in some number of years his children might look at him and see something worth looking at. He sat in the chair in Frank Del Vecchio's office on the 15th floor of a building on West 47th Street while the city spread out behind the glass and the men in the room waited for him to speak, and the silence stretched for 10 full seconds, which in a room like this felt like an hour, and which told every man present that something was shifting, that the decision being made in the quiet of Damien Moretti's expression was not the decision any of them had expected him to make. and that whatever came next was going to be unlike anything that had come before it in 23 years of watching this man navigate impossible rooms. He opened his mouth. "I'm done," Damien said. The room didn't react immediately. That was the thing about rooms full of men who had spent their lives reading threat levels and calibrating responses. They processed unexpected information with a delay, running it against every known pattern before allowing themselves to register that it didn't fit any of them. Frank Del Vecchio's hands were still flat on the desk. "Done," he repeated. "With the Santoros, with the territories, with all of it." Damien's voice was level. Not defeated. Something more deliberate than defeat. The voice of a man who has made a calculation that took everything into account and arrived at a number he can live with. "I'm not making that call. I'm not sending anyone to Astoria tonight. I'm not responding to the border moves." Tony Ricci pushed off the wall. "Damien, I heard you, Tony. If you don't respond, they take the territories, and then they take the next thing, and then I know how it works." Damien looked at him. "I invented how it works. In this city. I sat in rooms exactly like this one for 20 years, and I made exactly those calls, and every one of them cost something I didn't add up correctly at the time." He paused. "I'm adding it up now." The fourth man with the flat, calm eyes had closed his folder. He was watching Damien with an expression that was professionally neutral and privately astonished. Frank leaned back in his chair. The leather made a sound in the quiet room. He looked at Damien for a long time. The look of a man reviewing 20 years of a relationship and trying to locate within it some precedent for what he was hearing. "The organization," Frank said quietly. The people who depend on the organization need to find other arrangements." Damien said it without flinching, which was the hardest sentence he'd said in 20 years, because it was the first one that acknowledged out loud what he'd been privately calculating since he walked out of that courthouse. "I'm going to cooperate with the federal investigation. Voluntarily. Before they come to me with charges, I'm going to give them what they need to close the case cleanly, which means the Moretti organization as it currently exists won't exist by spring." "Bram Institsan," he looked at Frank. "I'm telling you first because you deserve that. You have time to restructure your exposure. Use it." Frank Del Vecchio sat very still. "You understand what you're describing," Frank said. "Yes. Not just for you, I understand." Damien stood up from the chair. His knees felt the standing in a way they hadn't 5 years ago, a detail that had become more noticeable lately, and that he'd been ignoring with the same practiced attention he'd given to everything he didn't want to examine. "What I built was built on things that shouldn't have been built on. I knew that. I made the calculation that the output justified the foundation. I was wrong." He picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair. "The Santoros can have the territories. They'll destroy themselves with them inside 3 years. They're too aggressive. They don't understand the long game. And without my organization providing the buffer structure that keeps the legitimate businesses insulated, they'll draw attention they're not equipped to handle. That's not my problem anymore." He looked around the room, at Tony, who had worked beside him for 16 years, and whose face was doing something complicated between loyalty and the practical calculation of self-preservation that every man in this world eventually had to perform. At Carol, who was simply watching. At the fourth man, who would file a report about this conversation and who Damien had already decided he didn't care about. At Frank. "You were a good ally," Damien said. "For 20 years. That's not nothing." Frank looked up at him. Something moved behind the older man's eyes. Not sentiment exactly, but its practical approximation. The acknowledgement of a long shared history by a man who had spent too long in a world that didn't value sentiment to be fluent in it anymore. "You're going to get killed," Frank said quietly. "Not as a threat. As an assessment. Maybe," Damien said, "but probably not. I'm not interesting enough to kill once I've cooperated. I become a liability in the wrong direction. Anyone who moves against me after I've talked to the feds creates more problems than it solves." He paused. "The Santoros are strategic, whatever else they are. They'll leave me alone." He walked to the door. His security lead moved with him, the long-practiced motion of a man who follows without requiring instruction. At the door, Damien stopped. "Tony," he said. Tony Ricci looked at him. "You have 3 kids," Damien said. "The youngest is what, 8 now?" "9," Tony said. His voice was rough. Go home to them. Tonight. Whatever comes next. Go home to them tonight. And don't make the same calculation I made. He held Tony's gaze for a moment. That's all I've got. He walked out. The next 14 days were the longest of his life, and also, in a way he couldn't have predicted and wouldn't have chosen, the most clarifying. Judge Dole delivered her ruling on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that was quieter than the opening session had been. The photographers were still outside, but there were fewer of them. The story had moved past its most spectacular moment and was now in its resolution phase, which is always less photographable. Damien sat at the defense table with Greaves beside him, and he did not bring anyone with him to the gallery, and he did not look at what Bianca's absence meant, and he did not perform anything for any camera. Elena sat at the plaintiff's table with Carla Voss, and she was the same as she had been throughout, present, composed, prepared. The ruling took 40 minutes to read into the record. Primary physical custody of Sophia, who was 17 and therefore had been consulted directly by the court, was awarded to Elena, with Damien receiving supervised visitation on a schedule to be reviewed quarterly and expanded as the relationship with his daughter was rebuilt. Sophia had submitted a written statement to the court. Damien had not been permitted to read it during proceedings, would only learn its contents later through Marco, in which she said she loved her father and was not finished with him but needed time, and that she thought time was the honest answer rather than the performed one. The judge had agreed. Marco was 20 and legally an adult, and not subject to the custody determination, a fact that the ruling acknowledged briefly and practically. The financial settlement. Elena was awarded 62% of the legitimate Moretti portfolio, enhanced from the standard marital division rate due to the documented asset concealment, calculated against the actual portfolio value as established by the court's own forensic accounting team. The figure, read aloud in the flat declarative language of legal proceedings, was just over $2 billion in assets, properties, and investment positions to be transferred to Elena Moretti within 90 days. The Children's Trust, as Greaves had argued, was ruled separate and intact. Damien sat through the reading of the ruling with his hands flat on the table and his breathing even and his face doing nothing. When it was done, he signed what needed to be signed, conferred briefly with Greaves about the next steps in the federal process, and walked out of the courthouse alone. His security detail had been reduced to 2 people following the organizational decisions of the previous weeks, and he waved them off at the bottom of the steps. They exchanged a look and stayed back. Elena came out 5 minutes after him. She was with Carla Voss and an assistant, and they were speaking quietly, heads together over something on a tablet, the efficient post-ruling logistics of people who have achieved what they came for and are already moving to the implementation phase. She didn't see him at first. He waited. It wasn't calculated. He wasn't sure what it was. Some pull toward a moment he hadn't planned, the same pull that had kept him sitting in that diner booth long after Marco left, looking at 2 empty coffee cups. She saw him when she reached the bottom of the steps. She said something to Carla Voss, who glanced at Damien with an expression of professional neutrality, and then took the assistant and moved a discreet distance away. Elena walked to where Damien was standing. She stopped 6 feet from him. Her coat was charcoal gray. Her hair was down, the first time he'd seen it down since the proceedings began, and she was looking at him with that clear, level attention that asked nothing of him and offered nothing to him and was simply the most honest form of eye contact he'd encountered in years. "I'm not going to ask you how you're doing," she said. "I know." "Good." A beat of silence. On the street behind them, traffic moved with its ordinary indifference. A cab honked twice. Someone's phone rang and was answered. "The federal process," he said. "I'm cooperating, voluntarily. Greaves is arranging the first meeting next week." She looked at him. A small adjustment in her expression. Not surprise, more like the confirmation of something she'd already considered. "For the children," she said. Not a question. "Yes. And—" He stopped. "And because it's the right thing, which I understand is not a phrase I have a lot of credibility saying." "No," she said. "You don't." "I know." She looked at him for another moment. The wind moved between them, cold and without ceremony. "Sophia's statement to the court," he said. "Marco told me she said she wasn't finished with me." Elena's expression didn't change exactly, but something in it shifted toward something more complicated. The expression of a woman who has protected her children from the worst of something for a long time, and is now in the difficult position of watching that protection give way to her children's own choices about who they want their father to be. "She's not," Elena said. "She's angry and she's hurt, and she doesn't know what to do with either of those things. But she's not finished." A pause. "She never stops talking, Sophia. You know that. You've always known that about her. She's been quiet for 4 months, and it's cost her more than either of you understand." Damien looked at his shoes briefly, looked back up. "I'm going to call her," he said. "Not today. When she's ready. However long that takes. She'll tell you when she's ready." "I know." Another silence. A longer one this time. The kind that isn't uncomfortable so much as weighted. The silence of two people standing at the end of something enormous and complex and shared, surveying it the way you survey the site of something that burned down, understanding both what was lost and why the burning happened, and that neither of those things erases the other. "Elena," he said. She waited. He had words available. He had sentences prepared in the abstract, apologies, acknowledgments, the language of accountability that Greaves had coached him toward for the custody hearing, and that he'd never quite managed to deliver with the weight it required, because weight required honesty, and honesty required looking directly at things he'd spent years looking away from. He looked at her directly now. "I built everything I built on what you gave me," he said. "The money at the beginning, the work throughout, the stability, He stopped. "The children, the home. The thing that made the empire mean something, which is the thing I never told you it meant." He pressed his lips together. "I told myself you knew, that it was understood, that you could see what I was building and understand that you were the reason I was building it." She said nothing. "You couldn't have known," he said. "I never said it. And by the time I understood what I had, I'd already spent years treating it like it didn't need to be protected, like it would always be there because it had always been there." He exhaled. "That's not a justification. It's just what I did. How I did it. Why I lost everything I was actually trying to have." Elena had not moved during this. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her coat and her eyes on him with that characteristic stillness, and she let him finish without interrupting, which was its own form of grace. Not forgiveness, not absolution, simply the willingness to allow a person the space to say the true thing. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Joel, I knew," she said finally. "Not that you loved me the way you should have, but I knew what I was to the structure of your life. I knew from early on. And I stayed anyway, which was my choice, and I made it with open eyes, and I don't—" She stopped, reorganized. "I'm not a victim of your choices, Damien. I made mine too. I chose to build inside the structure you created, and I chose to stay when I could have left earlier, and I chose to fight this the way I fought it. Every one of those was a decision." Her voice was level. "I don't want your guilt. I want my children to be okay, and I want to build something real with the assets the court awarded me, and I want to not spend the next 20 years bitter." She paused. "Bitterness is expensive. It costs more than you get back." He looked at her. "You're going to be fine," he said. Not a question, not a comfort, just the recognition of a fact he could see clearly from where he was standing. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." She held his gaze for a moment longer. 2 seconds? 3? The same clear attention she'd given him across the courtroom on the day it started. And then she turned and walked back to where Carla Voss was waiting, and she didn't look back. And that was the last time Damien Moretti stood that close to his wife of 23 years. He watched her go. Then he turned and started walking, and this time he had a direction. The federal cooperation process took 8 months. It was the most uncomfortable 8 months of Damien's life, which was a sentence that covered significant competition. It required sitting across a table from people whose institutional purpose was to dismantle what he'd built, and answering their questions with a completeness that was, at certain points, physically difficult, not because of what it exposed about the organization, but because of what it required him to acknowledge about himself. About the decisions, about the cost of each one, about the people who had been caught in the machinery that he'd run without ever asking whether the machinery should exist. The federal attorney on his case was a woman named Dana Park, 38 years old, sharp in the way that comes from genuine intelligence rather than performance, who treated him throughout the process with a professional courtesy that was entirely without warmth. He respected her more for this. Warmth would have felt like something to manage. Her absence of it meant he was simply dealing with what was actually there. The agreement they reached was structured carefully, painstakingly, by Greaves across 17 drafts. Damien provided a comprehensive accounting of the organizational structures, the financial arrangements, the territory agreements, the network of relationships that had allowed the criminal operations to coexist with the legitimate businesses for 2 decades. In exchange, the exposure was shaped in ways that, while not painless, were survivable. A substantial financial penalty. A period of supervised financial activity. No custodial sentence, contingent on continued cooperation and the maintenance of certain conditions. He would not go to prison. He would, however, become a significantly diminished version of what he had been, which was, he had come to understand, appropriate. The Santoro family took the Queen's territories in March, as predicted. By October, they had drawn the attention of 2 separate federal task forces through a series of decisions that demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic impatience Damien had diagnosed. Too aggressive, too visible, too convinced that territory was power, when actual power was the ability to remain unnoticed by the systems designed to dismantle you. By December, the Santoro leadership was under indictment. The territories became contested again, but Damien wasn't part of that story anymore. He read about it in the newspaper the way you read about weather in a city you used to live in. He sold the penthouse, moved into a 4-bedroom house in a neighborhood that was comfortable without being ostentatious, a word that would have struck him as inadequate as a standard 18 months ago, but now felt precisely right. He needed 4 bedrooms because he intended, eventually, to have people in them. He kept that intention to himself as a form of private discipline, a promise held in trust against a future he couldn't yet see clearly. Sophia called him in April. He was in the kitchen of the new house, making coffee, when his phone lit up with her name. He stood looking at it for the full first ring, the way you stand looking at something you've been waiting for long enough that its arrival feels slightly unreal. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said. "Hey." His voice came out steadier than he'd expected. A pause. He could hear her breathing. He could hear in the background the specific ambient noise of the Upper East Side house, the hiss of the radiator that had always run slightly too hot in the kitchen, a sound he'd heard for 17 years without ever consciously registering it. "I got your letter," she said. He had written her a letter in February. 12 pages, handwritten, which was the first time he'd handwritten anything of significance in years because typing had felt insufficient, had felt like a way of keeping a buffer between himself and what he was trying to say. He'd written it and rewritten it 4 times and then written the final version in one sitting at 2 in the morning and mailed it without rereading it because he understood that if he reread it, he'd find 100 ways to make it more controlled and less true. "Okay," he said. "It was—" She stopped. He heard her gather herself. "It was a lot. I know. I'm sorry if—" "No," she said. "It was a lot in a good way. It was a lot in the way of it being more than I expected." Another pause. "You said you weren't going to ask me for anything, in the letter." "I meant it." "I know. That's why I'm calling." Her voice was 17 years old and also somehow much older, and it moved through him with the particular force that only your children's voices can manage. "I don't want you to not ask for anything forever. I want—" She stopped again. He waited. He was very good at waiting now, which was new. "I want us to figure out how to do this, whatever this is. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how to be your daughter right now and also be honest about what I feel. But I want to figure that out. I don't want to just—" Her voice caught, briefly, and steadied. "I don't want to just write you off. That's not who I am." "No," he said. "It's not. Mom said it was my decision. It is. She also said—" A small pause. "She said that people can change if the thing they're changing toward is real. She said she didn't know if that was true for you, but that it was worth finding out." Another pause. "That's not nothing, coming from her." "No," Damien said. "It's not nothing. He was standing in the kitchen of the new house with the coffee going cold beside him and his daughter's voice in his ear, and outside the window the April light was coming at the angle it comes in spring, low and bright and new. And he thought about Elena sitting at a kitchen table in February saying, "I know about Bianca," with a voice so level it had felt like nothing at the time. He understood now what it had cost her to be that level. He understood what everything had cost her. He was still in the early stages of understanding it, the way you're in the early stages of understanding something enormous. You can see its edges, but not its full dimensions, and you'll be learning its dimensions for a very long time. "I'd like to get coffee," Sophia said. "Just coffee. Somewhere. When you're ready." "I'm ready," he said. "I know. But I meant when I'm ready." There was something in her voice that might have been, very quietly, humor. The dark and tentative humor of a person who has been through something hard and is testing whether lightness is available yet. "Give me a couple weeks. Take whatever you need." "Okay." "Sophia." "Yeah." "Thank you," he said, "for calling." She was quiet for a moment. "Don't make it weird, Dad," she said, and then she laughed, a real laugh, brief and surprised, as if it had escaped before she decided to allow it. And the sound of it was the best thing he'd heard in 2 years. She hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a while after that, in the quiet of the new house, with the coffee going cold and the April light on the window, and he let it be what it was without trying to manage it or measure it or convert it into strategy. He was 52 years old. He had ruled a city and lost a family, and the ruling hadn't been worth what the losing cost. He had spent 23 years building an empire on a foundation that included a woman who had deserved better and received less, and the empire was gone now, and the woman had taken what she was owed and built something better with it. And his children were still in the world and were still, barely, provisionally, on their own careful terms, willing to test whether he was capable of being someone they could know. That was what he had, not the penthouse, not the organization, not the territories or the arrangements or the fear that his name produced in rooms he no longer entered. None of it. What he had was a 4-bedroom house in a neighborhood where nobody knew what his name used to mean, and a daughter who had called him on a Tuesday morning in April, and a son who sent a text every 10 days or so that was brief and functional and present, and an ex-wife who was building a company with the $2 billion the court had awarded her, and who was, by every account that reached him, building it with the same meticulous intelligence she'd applied to everything she'd ever touched. He poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh cup. He took it to the window and stood there looking at the street. A kid on a bicycle went past. A woman with a dog. A delivery truck double-parked with the hazards on while the driver moved boxes with the efficient physicality of someone who does the same thing every day and has made a certain peace with doing the same thing every day. None of them looked up. The city moved without him. And he watched it move, and he felt, under the weight of everything he'd lost and was still losing and would continue to reckon with for years, the very faint and completely unfamiliar sensation of a man who has put something down that was too heavy to carry and discovered that his hands, now empty, are still his own. He had a meeting with Greaves at noon. He had a call with the federal attorney at 3. He had a contractor coming at 5 to look at the basement of the house, which he intended to convert into a workspace, not for anything the way things had been, but for something else, something he hadn't defined yet, something that required the physical act of building before the definition would come. He had, against every reasonable expectation, a future, not the one he'd planned, not the one he'd fought for, not the one he'd believed, standing on the courthouse steps with Bianca's hand in his, and the cameras firing and New York spread out around him like a kingdom he thought he owned, was the natural consequence of being Damian Moretti. The one that was left after everything else was gone, which was, he was beginning to understand, the only kind that had ever been real. He finished his coffee. He put the cup in the sink. He went to get ready for the day.